January 26, 1945. The bitter winter of the European campaign clung to the shattered village of Holzwehr, France. Snow drifted through the skeletal remains of trees and half-buried the wreckage of war. Burned-out vehicles, helmets, and shattered rifles scattered across the frozen ground. Inside a makeshift German aid station, a soldier from the 2nd Mountain Division stood by the frost-coated window, his breath fogging the glass as he watched the medics drag in the wounded one after another. Their faces were grey with exhaustion, uniforms soaked in blood and melted snow. Somewhere in the distance, the faint echo of gunfire still rolled through the trees like distant thunder. He had just survived one of the most lopsided, bewildering engagements of the entire war. His unit, 250 men, backed by 6 tanks, had assaulted a single American position. Not a fortified line, not a battalion, or even a platoon. Just one man, a young lieutenant, standing defiantly atop a burning tank destroyer. That man had turned a single, .50 caliber Browning M2 machine gun into a weapon of annihilation. Within an hour, more than 2/3 of the German attackers lay dead, dying, or scattered. What had begun as a confident assault had ended in chaos. The survivors stumbled back through the smoke and snow, whispering about the weapon that had halted them cold. It was not a new secret device, not one of Hitler's promised wonder weapons. It was something simple, American, mechanical, and merciless. The Browning M2 .50 caliber heavy machine gun. The German soldier at the window had seen the aftermath. Dozens of bodies sprawled across the field, tanks burning like funeral pyres, their steel carcasses punctured and smoking. He had heard the moans of the wounded echoing through the trees and smelled the acrid mix of fuel, snow, and flesh. And all of it, every ruin, every loss, had been inflicted by one man behind one machine gun. That man was First Lieutenant Audie Murphy. Murphy, already wounded, had climbed onto a burning M10 tank destroyer, flames licking at his boots, smoke choking his lungs, and turned its turret-mounted Browning .50 toward the advancing German column. The tank destroyer was a torch, but the gun was alive, spitting streams of fire and steel. For over an hour, he fought alone, refusing to retreat even when shells burst around him. When the gun finally fell silent, 50 German soldiers lay dead and scores more wounded. The rest had broken and fled. The Medal of Honor citation that Lieutenant General Alexander Patch signed on June 2, 1945, would record that number, 50 enemy casualties. But no citation could capture the terror the survivors carried. To them, that heavy machine gun had been less a weapon than an elemental force. They had faced artillery before, mortars, tanks, and aircraft. None had the cold, intimate horror of that gun's impact. Those who survived the encounter spoke not only of the man who fired it but of the sound. The deep, relentless rhythm of its fire, and the monstrous destruction it caused. German medical personnel soon learned to recognize the aftermath of .50 caliber wounds. Unlike rifle rounds, which could leave a man crippled but alive, these bullets tore through flesh and bone with catastrophic violence. Limbs were severed. Torso hits were almost always fatal. The kinetic energy was so enormous that even a near miss could maim by the shockwave alone. Field hospitals could do little. They bandaged, injected morphine, whispered prayers, and waited. The rest was silence. But even for those untouched physically, the psychological wounds ran deep. German units that came under sustained .50 caliber fire suffered higher rates of combat fatigue, breakdowns, and desertion than under any other small arms threat. The men learned that no cover seemed safe. A wall, a trench, a tree, none could guarantee protection. The knowledge that survival was a matter of random luck, not skill or courage, gnawed at morale. Soldiers stopped believing they could influence their fate. That belief alone was enough to break a man. Holzwehr was not unique. Across continents and campaigns, from the hedgerows of Normandy to the sands of North Africa, from the Ardennes to the skies over Germany itself, the Germans encountered that same brutal rhythm, the heavy, thunderous beat of the Browning M2, between 450 and 575 rounds a minute, each 1/2-inch slug of copper, jacketed death capable of punching through armor, concrete, or human bodies with equal ease. Soldiers learned to recognize it instantly. They called it the Koschwanz, the cow's tail, for the way its tracers swept methodically across the battlefield. Wherever it spoke, men ducked or died. Yet the weapons' reign of terror had begun not on the ground, but in the skies. September 6, 1943. The air above Stuttgart roared with engines. 388 B-17 flying fortresses, their wings glinting in the sunlight, approached Germany's industrial heart. This was no single raid. It was the beginning of daylight strategic bombing on a scale the world had never seen. Luftwaffe squadrons scrambled from their airfields. Veterans, aces, men who had dominated the skies over Europe since 1940. They climbed in their Foch, Wolf 190s and Messerschmitt 109s, certain that once again, they would scatter the Americans in flames. They dove from the sun, cannons thundering, confident in the firepower of their 20 mm and 13 mm guns. But then the bombers answered. What the German pilots saw that day defied everything they knew about aerial combat. The bombers did not fly helplessly toward their targets as lumbering prey. They erupted in flame, but it was muzzle flash, not destruction. Each B-17 bristled with 13 Browning M2 machine guns, arranged to cover every angle of attack. A formation of 36 bombers meant nearly 500 heavy machine guns, all firing in unison. Together they unleashed over 6 Saracen rounds every minute, weaving a shimmering wall of steel around the formation. German fighters tore into that wall, and were torn apart. The first attack run ended with aircraft plunging earthward, trailing smoke, wings shredded, engines seized. Pilots who had expected an easy slaughter found themselves flying into a storm that no man could penetrate and live. The 50 caliber rounds ripped through fuselages, wings and cockpits, exploding fuel lines and shattering control cables. It was not precision shooting. It didn't need to be. It was sheer volume, an industrial storm of lead. 45 bombers were lost that day. But the Luftwaffe's losses were irreplaceable. Experienced aces burned from the sky, their replacements raw and fearful. What the Germans faced was more than a weapon. It was a philosophy. The Americans had redefined defense not by perfection, but by redundancy. They did not seek efficiency, they sought dominance through overwhelming fire. Where one gun might fail, 10 others would not. Each bomber carried between 5,000 and 7,000 rounds, enough for sustained combat across the entire mission. Crews often crammed extra boxes of ammunition into the fuselage, knowing that to run out was death. Every gunner understood that he was part of a machine far larger than himself. Each gun covered his comrade's blind spot, each field of fire overlapped, and together they formed a sphere of destruction that no enemy could breach. German pilots learned to dread that formation. Oberleutnant Hinrich Wormheld, an ace with 93 victories, wrote home in despair. To attack the Americans is to fly through a storm of steel. For every tracer you see, 4 more you do not see are already upon you. You begin your attack already dying. No tactic worked for long. From above, from below, from the sides, every approach met a rain of 50 caliber fire. The Americans had created something that functioned like a living organism, each gun responding instinctively to movement, light, and sound. The formations were mathematical in precision, 3-dimensional grids designed to eliminate blind spots. To reach cannon range was to die, and unlike German weapons, which jammed easily in freezing air, the Brownings simply worked. Cold, dirt, altitude. It did not matter. They fired until the barrels glowed and then were replaced in minutes. Luftwaffe pilots began calling the bomber streams Fliegende Festungen, flying fortresses. Not for their armor, but for their guns. Lieutenant Wolfgang Fischer, who survived the war, said it plainly in his post-war debrief. It was like flying into a meat grinder. The ground war told the same story in different language. June 6, 1944. Normandy. Dawn broke over grey surf and burning ships. Major Hans von Luck of the 21st Panzer Division watched from his command post as the sea itself seemed to disgorge an army. His men were veterans, trained, disciplined, confident. But what von Luck encountered that day rewrote everything he believed about tactics. The Americans did not fight as the Germans did. They did not rely on elegance or precision. They relied on firepower, and the .50 caliber was its beating heart. Every jeep, every truck, every half-track and tank carried one. Even supply convoys bristled with them. When von Luck's troops tried to maneuver, they were met with instantaneous, relentless fire. It was as if the landscape itself had turned hostile. He wrote later, "Wehr had been told our superior training would offset their numbers. I learned instead that numbers make training irrelevant. They fired until nothing moved. Their mistakes did not matter. They had the ammunition to erase them." The Germans prided themselves on their machine gun doctrine. The MG-34 and MG-42 were technological marvels, fast, deadly, and efficient. But they were tools of precision, not abundance. Each squad revolved around its machine gun crew, with limited ammunition to sustain carefully aimed bursts. The Americans, by contrast, treated the .50 caliber not as a special weapon but as standard equipment. They fired not in bursts but in floods. An American armored division could advance through France, with hundreds of these guns roaring at once. Supply convoys practiced. Reconnaissance by fire, firing into every hedgerow, farmhouse, or tree line that looked suspicious. German troops found themselves pinned down before they could even see their attackers. Ambushes that would once have been textbook success turned suicidal. Captured German officers later admitted the futility. Against the Americans, you could not even raise your head. They fired at everything, and they could afford to. By mid-1944, the mere sound of a .50 caliber burst was enough to halt an attack. The Germans' vaunted discipline disintegrated under the weight of continuous, unstoppable fire. Convoy ambushes failed. Infantry assaults withered. The .50 caliber had become not just a weapon, but an idea that survival was no longer a contest of skill, but of supply. The M16 multiple-gun motor carriage embodied that philosophy to its extreme. A half-track mounting 4.50 calibers in a powered turret, it could unleash 200 rounds per minute. Originally built for anti-aircraft defense, it became a nightmare for ground troops. Soldiers nicknamed it the meat chopper. During the Battle of the Bulge, these vehicles swept entire German infantry formations from existence, their streams of fire crossing like scythers. The sound alone broke attacks before the first bullet struck. By then, German ambush doctrine was obsolete. The Americans placed .50 caliber guns throughout every convoy, each vehicle trained to fire left or right in alternating patterns. When an ambush began, the convoy did not scatter. It replied. The returning fire was so violent that ambushers often suffered heavier losses than their targets. German units began avoiding American columns altogether, attacking only isolated stragglers, but isolation was rare. The Americans moved as a machine, every part armed, armored, and alert. The impact of this went far beyond the battlefield. Because German units could not cut American supply lines, the entire German front began to starve. Of ammunition, of fuel, of morale. Every belt of tracer fire that arsed across the French night was a reminder that the Americans had factories behind them. Limitless, tireless, unstoppable. And from above, death fell again in the form of the P-47 Thunderbolt. The Jug. 8 .50 caliber Brownings lined its wings, each pouring 400 rounds per minute into the earth below. A single flight of 4 could saturate a battlefield with 32 guns firing simultaneously. German convoys that dared to move in daylight were annihilated within minutes. Survivors spoke of strafing runs as iron rain. Trees were cut in half, trucks evaporated, men disappeared. One sergeant described it in his interrogation. You hear the engines. Then everything is fire. There is no warning, no cover. A wall, a truck, even a tank, it all bursts apart. You stop believing in safety. By late summer 1944, the Germans had learned to move only at night or through storms. But that meant movement slowed to a crawl. Supplies arrived late, reinforcements later still. American pilots flew armed reconnaissance, hunting anything that moved. Each gun carried enough ammunition for multiple passes, enough to turn every road into a death trap. And as the sky fell, the ground erupted. American vehicles fired through darkness, their tracer rounds lighting the night like comets. Every fifth bullet glowed red, a streak that marked death's path. Germans learned that for each tracer they saw, 4 invisible rounds followed. Men froze, mesmerized, calculating futilely whether to duck or run. The tracers made the invisible visible, and that was part of the terror. At night, American reconnaissance by fire transformed the front lines into a blazing grid of intersecting arcs. German veterans later called it the glowing cage. They said it felt like being trapped inside a furnace of light. A squad leader captured near Aachen recalled, "At night, you can see them firing even when they cannot see you. They shoot at movement, at sounds, at shadows. The sky is full of burning lines, and behind every one are bullets you cannot see. You stop moving. You stop thinking. You just wait." By the winter of 1944, that fear had hardened into something close to fatalism. In foxholes and shattered towns, German infantrymen whispered that to face the Americans was to face der Schleicheater ohne Gesicht, the faceless butcher. They didn't mean a man, they meant the sound. That deep, rolling thunder of the Browning M2, echoing through the night, meant that death had already chosen its next victims. Some men froze where they stood, others fired wildly into the darkness, desperate to silence the noise. But the gun never slept, and the fire never stopped. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, that truth became undeniable. The forests were heavy with snow, muffling footsteps, absorbing voices. German paratroopers, veterans of countless campaigns, moved through the woods confident in their stealth. Their mission: sever the American line and seize key crossroads. They expected confusion. They found annihilation. The moment the first snow-covered branches shifted, the forest erupted. Every American jeep, every tank destroyer, every truck, each one mounted with that same merciless gun, opened fire. The tracers turned the night into day. Trees exploded into splinters. Snow burst upward in geysers. Within seconds, the ambushers were the ambushed. Those who survived later described it as being swallowed by thunder. One survivor, Oberstfreiter Ernst Keller, wrote in his diary before being captured, "It was like standing in front of God's furnace." He never wrote again. The next entry was made by the American officer who found his body. The .50 caliber was no longer just a weapon of war. It had become the embodiment of industrial warfare itself. The German soldier carried his nation's finest craftsmanship, the K9 rifle, the MG-42 machine gun, the Panzerfaust. They were elegant, efficient, precise. The American soldier carried the .50 caliber, a tool of brute force. And yet, on the battlefield, brute force prevailed. Precision lost to power, discipline lost to volume, strategy lost to production. By early 1945, the front had dissolved into retreat. The Luftwaffe was broken. Its aces dead or grounded, its aircraft shredded by endless belts of .50 caliber fire. The tanks of the Wehrmacht lay smouldering on the roads, their armor pierced, their crews dead before they ever saw their attackers. Convoys no longer dared to move in daylight. Bridges were abandoned. Villages were left undefended. When American columns approached, civilians waved white flags long before the first tank arrived. They had seen what happened when resistance was attempted. Even hardened SS units, once the embodiment of fanaticism, hesitated. In some sectors, they refused orders to attack fortified American positions after reconnaissance reported the presence of multiple Browning emplacements. Commanders filed excuses: lack of artillery support, impassable terrain, communications failure. The truth was simpler. They knew the outcome. Captured officers began to describe the psychological toll. Major Wilhelm Kappel, taken prisoner in March 1945, explained it with chilling clarity. Our men no longer feared the American soldier. They feared his gun. They feared the sound it made, the way it tore through everything. It was not a battle anymore. It was slaughter. The Red Cross hospitals behind the lines were overwhelmed. Surgeons who had once treated neat, surgical wounds from rifle fire now faced devastation. Limbs shredded beyond repair, torsos blown open, skulls crushed. They amputated constantly. They stitched when possible, bandaged when hopeless, and prayed the morphine would last until dawn. For many, it didn't. The horror left its mark not only on the wounded but on those who treated them. Nurses refused to enter operating rooms after .50 caliber casualties arrived. One doctor, Oberarzt Franz Heller, reportedly went mad after 3 days of surgeries, screaming that he could still hear the gun firing in his head. The terror wasn't confined to the front. German civilians came to recognize the weapon, too. Allied strafing runs turned roads, trains, and fields into killing grounds. A single P-47 could empty its ammunition into a convoy, cutting through cars, horses, and men alike. Survivors remembered how the bullets seemed to come from everywhere at once. Even those far from the front could not escape it. The sky was filled with that same mechanical heartbeat, the growl of the engine followed by the staccato roar of the Brownings. To them, it was the sound of the end, the promise that nothing remained untouched. By the time the Allies crossed the Rhine, the .50 caliber had become the symbol of American invincibility. The Germans had no equivalent. Their 13mm MG-131 lacked the same penetration. Their 20mm cannons were devastating but heavy, suited for aircraft or fortifications, not for infantry or vehicles. Nothing matched the versatility of the Browning. It could be mounted on tanks, trucks, jeeps, planes, ships, or even tripods carried by men. It fired at freezing temperatures, in desert heat, underwater if needed. It never jammed, never surrendered, and its reach was absolute. When the first P-51 Mustangs began escorting bombers deep into Germany, the Luftwaffe finally faced extinction. Each Mustang carried 6 .50 caliber Brownings, nearly 2,000 rounds of high-velocity firepower. The German fighters that had once ruled the sky could no longer approach the bombers. The Mustangs hunted them mercilessly. The air war became a massacre. German pilots reported seeing their comrades explode into vapor under a hail of .50 caliber rounds before they could even engage. The gunners in the bombers, who had once prayed for survival, now watched in grim satisfaction as enemy fighters disintegrated mid-dive. In the final months, it was no longer a war of strategy. It was an industrial execution. American columns advanced with unstoppable rhythm, infantry supported by tanks, tanks shielded by aircraft, and everything guarded by the thunder of the .50 caliber. When the fighting reached German soil, even the most hardened soldiers understood the futility. Resistance meant death. Surrender meant life. They began surrendering in droves, sometimes entire companies waving white cloths before a single shot was fired. Many admitted afterward that it wasn't fear of artillery, tanks, or bombers that broke them. It was the knowledge that the Americans would fire without hesitation, that their weapons never ran dry. The .50 caliber became a symbol of inevitability. It appeared in every theater, on every front, in every photograph of American victory. On Pacific beaches, it shredded palm trees and concrete bunkers alike. In Europe, it destroyed stone walls that had stood for centuries. On bombers, it filled the sky with invisible webs of death. On tanks, it silenced ambushes before they began. It was the one constant in a world collapsing under mechanized war. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the weapon remained. It did not fade with victory. It had become so reliable, so effective, that armies across the world adopted it. In Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, the same weapon, nearly unchanged in design, continued its reign. More than 8 decades after its creation, the Browning M2 still served. Soldiers still trusted it. Enemies still feared it. And yet, those who fought against it first, the men who faced it in France, in the Ardennes, in the skies above Stuttgart, never forgot. Many of them lived to tell the tale, but none could ever describe it without a tremor in their voice. The memory was too vivid, too total. They had seen what it did to flesh, to bone, to morale, to entire armies. One German veteran, interviewed decades later, said simply, "We did not lose to soldiers. We lost to machines. The Americans built a gun that never got tired, never got hungry, never got scared, and when it spoke, men died." His interviewer asked if he still dreamed of it. The old man nodded. "Every night. It does not fire anymore, but I still hear it. Thump, 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 like a drum that never stops." It was the sound of the 20th century's most enduring weapon. The voice of Audie Murphy's fury, of the flying fortresses, of every convoy and every hill. A weapon so simple and brutal that outlived empires, outlasted ideologies, and reshaped warfare forever. The Browning M2 .50 caliber machine gun, born from American industry, baptized in European blood, was not just a tool of war. It was the mechanical embodiment of total war itself, relentless, impersonal, and unstoppable.